All right. Had a little bit of a funky start there, but we're getting back into Locke's two treatises of government, specifically the second treatise. We're continuing with our summary and analysis and critique. So chapters 17 and 18 are what we're going to be covering this week, and they are titled Of Usurpation and Of Tyranny, respectively. And it's kind of good that we covered them, that we're covering at the same time, because they actually do talk about each other a little bit. And part of what's going on is that Locke is trying to make two separate phenomena have two separate names. And so, you can have a situation where there is usurpation and tyranny, or you can have just tyranny, or you can have just usurpation. And these are all different things that Locke is going to try to help us, or going to try to make definitions so that we can kind of differentiate between these things. So, starting out, chapter 17, of usurpation. Usurpation, Locke says, I'm paraphrasing here, is the transfer of agreed-upon powers of government to one who is not the ruler or rulers that are prescribed by the rules that determine who rightfully holds power. If someone overthrows a king and calls himself king, even though he isn't in the succession line, right? But still, he can. That's a usurpation. He might, in fact, continue to rule, judiciously and well, even. But even so, this is usurpation, according to Locke. This is not to be confused with tyranny, which is the extension of government power beyond its agreed-upon limits. We're going to cover that in the next chapter. Instead, what happens is the form of the government remains, but the holders of the government power are not correct. Basically, one of the things that Locke is saying here is that all governments must include some kind of rule set to determine who holds government power and how government power is transferred from one group to the next, whether it be by hereditary succession, or by voting, or by representative voting, or whatever, right? Locke says that in a well-formed state, basically, there must be some kind of way to determine who rules next, otherwise your society necessarily collapses every time there's a new generation. And there might be some good points to that, right? It was Thomas Jefferson who said something along the lines of, there should have to be a new constitution every 29 years or something like that, so that one generation doesn't bind the previous or bind the next. And this kind of thing, like this chapter 17, is super short, because it's just basically a definition of what usurpation is, to differentiate it from tyranny. And this is one of the reasons why I kind of have been complaining about the structure of this book, or the order of things in this book, because usually you should get the definitions first, and then to the things that are implied from them, rather than doing a bunch of building up of various ideas and then only to go back and say, here are definitions. Especially when, as we've seen, Locke seems to be pretty, not down on, but like skeptical of most existing governments at his time and whether they're actually legitimate. And so these definitions of usurpation and tyranny seem like they'd be particularly, relevant to someone who's writing about governments from a skeptical perspective, right? So, what Locke says about usurpers and usurpation is that usurpers never have the right on their side while they're still usurpers. They have no right to be obeyed. If someone installs himself as the king, he may try to exercise the powers of the government, and he may have people, from the government who are the same people as before, following his orders, but there's no reason why, or rather there's no requirement that the people obey a usurper. However, what Locke notes is that people can, by and only by their consent, legitimize a usurper. This is kind of similar to what happened with the Constitution versus the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation were never formally dissolved, right? What happened was that the states, and as proxies for the people, had made this agreement where they were part of this organization that was created by the Articles of Confederation, and then they all voted to basically put themselves under a different thing, which is what we call the Constitution today. Putting aside the positives and negatives of that, what actually happened, presumably, was that by having people vote in the states to change who holds the power, that power was therefore made legitimate, but wasn't legitimate until those votes were actually completed. All right, so now we move on to chapter 18 of tyranny. And tyranny is differentiated in Locke's mind from usurpation by this. Whereas usurpation is the movement of proper government powers to the wrong person or body of persons, tyranny is the exercise of power beyond what one has or can have a right to as a member of the government. Now, there are kind of like three general categories that this falls into. Number one, you can have an extension of powers beyond the agreement of the people. The example of this would be the government exercising unconstitutional powers, limiting speech when it has been forbidden from limiting speech. Number two would be the extension of powers beyond the laws of nature. Now, this is a little bit more fuzzy because the laws of nature are not perfectly known. They're, questions that have to be answered by reason. And so this is kind of one of those cases where the people have less of a clear leg to stand on, right? Because they'll say, well, this is something that we didn't have, that none of us as individuals had, this power. Conscription might be a good example of that, right? Where it might be in the Constitution that conscription is allowed. I mean, it's not, I think, right? Like, the 13th Amendment seems like it ought to outlaw conscription, but conscription is the law of the land, at least as well as it's being enforced. And so, like, conscription is something that a person does not have the right to do, right? And so therefore, when people join together, they also don't have the right to do that either. So that would be a good example maybe of that. Another might be laws that are intended to kind of like socially nudge through tax policy, right? Because the purpose of government, according to Locke, is to safeguard the property and rights of the people, and not to encourage them to act a certain way by way of stealing more from the people than otherwise they would take, right? So maybe something like that. And number three, and this is something that also is a little bit fuzzy, but like it's fuzzy in a different way, is that if the government or the agents of the government begin to use their agreed upon powers for the purposes of self-enrichment, that would also be a tyranny in Locke's perspective. So Locke says something like this: a just king is ordained for protecting wealth and property of his people, right? A tyrant, on the other hand, sees his people as means for his own satisfaction. Locke talks about a king having a double oath, where the first part of the oath is this: that the king must observe the fundamental laws. Remember that Locke says that arbitrary power is not something that can be given to a king, at least not in a well-formed government, not in a Lockean system. There has to be some kind of document or agreement, at least, that says what the king can and cannot do. Those fundamental laws that are given, that are a form of the consent of the people, that they're the fulcrum that the consent of the people rests on, right? Those fundamental laws must be obeyed by the king. They must be observed by the king. So constitutional limits, the requirement that the government act for the benefit of the people, the requirement that the government follow laws and procedures that it makes for itself, due process, things like that. I mean, Locke doesn't use the phrase due process, but he's kind of getting at like a kernel of what would become what we call due process. The second part of the oath of a king is that he observe and follow the pact made with the people. And this is a little bit different because, or it's a little bit hard to tell where the pact made with the people differs from like constitutional limits. I guess you could say that the people might argue that the government or the king might have certain powers to like administer certain things, or he might have certain areas of prerogative, which we've talked about before. And it might be that's what Locke means when he talks about following the pact with the people. Anyway, Locke notes that all good, non-tyrannical kings are happy to obey and observe their limits. And in fact, he goes so far as to say that those who try to convince a king to go in a tyrannical direction are, quote, vipers and pests, both against them, the kings, and the commonwealth, end quote. We'll see how Locke deals with immunity later in this chapter. It's it's interesting because I think he's making a carve-out that doesn't necessarily need to be there, although he does accommodate cases where that carve-out doesn't exist, but we'll get to that in a minute. So, Locke notes that these double oaths apply to oligarchical or representative governments just as much as a monarchical or, unitary government would, as, if it intends to be a Lockean government, not might makes right, but rather government by consent, service. And he says that, quote, wherever law ends, tyranny begins, end quote. So, again, Locke is appealing here to a sense of there's an artifact, the law, right, that not only the people must obey, but also the people's servants, that is to say, their government. And if the government begins to act outside of those laws, then it is exercising tyranny. And, pretty simple concept there. Locke has some fun examples also here in section 202, actually. We're going to talk about a couple of these. For instance, he gives an example of a warrant, where the warrant enables an agent of the government to seize a person as he walks around outside. Say he goes to a market or something like that. And it says, well, yeah, that warrant says you may seize him at market or, on the road. But if that warrant does not say that you may enter his property to seize him, then you must not enter his property to seize him. He's very strict about these kinds of things. That the breadth of a warrant is important because it's part of what gives this legal framework it's legitimacy is not the right word, but I mean I mean more like it's like sense of following the rules, if that makes sense. Locke gives us a couple other examples in this section. He talks about an eldest brother who inherits the vast majority of his father's holdings, and he says that for instance, the inheritance of a big part of the father's holdings does not give him any right over the smaller parts that went to his younger siblings. Right? He talks about a rich neighbor. He says that the fact that this rich neighbor, is super rich and great doesn't give him any claim over a poor neighbor that he, is over which he has no agreement with, right? Maybe I'll just go through these. Is it reasonable, quote, is it reasonable that the eldest brother, because he has the greatest part of his father's estate, should thereby have a right to take away any of his younger brother's portions? Or that a rich man, who possessed a whole country, should from thence have a right to seize, when he pleased, the cottage and garden of his poor neighbor, end quote. Basically, Locke is saying that government's powers and people's powers are limited to what they have, a right to act on, and doesn't go one iota beyond that. I almost think about when I read his example about warrants. He that hath authority to seize my person in the street may be opposed as a thief and a robber if he endeavors to break into my house to execute a writ. This makes me kind of think about like the war on drugs kind of thing, right? Where maybe warrants are being produced, no-knock warrant kind of stuff, right? There's a question of the legal validity of those, and I don't know. I didn't really develop it too much, but there's something there, I feel like, so maybe you have some kind of an idea. Anyway, so Locke says this, that generally speaking, government action is unlike a robber in the sense that, if someone points a gun at you and says, "Give me your wallet," you don't have any way to appeal to a court or something and say, "Oh, make this guy stop," right? If you are dead, there's no way to bring that back to you. And so Locke says that force is only valid against unjust and unlawful force, and you'd better be darn sure that the force that you're defending yourself against is unjust and unlawful. Otherwise, you might be justly condemned by your peers. Now, here's where Locke gets into something that I think is a little weird. Locke talks about how the law typically protects the body of the prince, like from resistance. And he says that, well, the amount of damage that a single person can do is pretty small, and so this is a pretty normal, like, part of the legal system, is that the chief executive or the whatever is immune to any kind of to like self-defense, which I think is carving out too much of a weird hole, because it's not just that this one person, suddenly goes crazy and starts stabbing people or something like that. It's more like he oversteps his bounds by a little bit, and the people around him say, yeah, okay. And then he oversteps his bounds just a little bit more, and people say, yeah, okay, up to the point where, he grabs for himself the divine right of whatever, and everybody's like, yeah, that sounds about right. There's a like a propagandistic thing that can happen with heads of state if they are allowed to, get away with regular crimes. So, despite that kind of weird carve out that Locke makes, he does cover the case where that carve out isn't made later. So we'll keep going. What Locke says is always justified, though, is that one may oppose illegal acts of the inferior officers of the king or prince. So, to quote, this privilege, speaking of the privilege of being free from, self-defense, quote, belonging only to the king's person, hinders not, but they may be questioned, opposed, and resisted who use unjust force, though they pretend a commission from him. Now, this is where things get a little fun, because Locke also says that if it is a commission, quote, which the law authorizes not, as is plain in the case of him that has the king's writ to arrest a man, which is a full commission from the king, and yet he that has it cannot break open a man's house to do it, nor execute this command of the king upon certain days, nor in certain places, though this commission have no such exception in it, but they are the limitations of the law, which if any one transgress, the king's commission excuses him not, for the king's authority being given him only by the law, he cannot empower anyone to act against the law, or justify him by his commission in so doing. What's he saying here? He's saying that this is kind of like proto-due process. He's saying that if the law says that warrants may only be executed on Tuesday, and I'm giving an absurd example, but the point is that if a law says that, if that is the law of the land, and someone tries to execute a warrant on a Wednesday, then self-defense against that person is perfectly justified, because they are not justified. Their commission is fraudulent, according to the law. Here is a point where Locke is very specifically putting the law above the ruler and his officers. And this is kind of where things are a little bit interesting. Because, whereas Locke is kind of excusing the harm that one person can do by saying, well, the harm that one man can do is pretty limited. By the way, secession fixes this, right? If you can say, you're not my prince anymore, then that fixes the problem of the prince being, immune to self-defense, right? If he starts doing bad things, then people can just say, no, you're out, kind of thing, right? So Locke notes that occasional princely, and I believe I'm quoting here, mischiefs, end quote, are outweighed by the peace of public and the security of the government. So what he's saying here is that the general peace that is created by a well-functioning government, that the security that is inherent in a well-functioning government excuses the little mischiefs of a prince or a king. I mean, this is an extremely dangerous idea. It's dangerous like prerogative, right? In fact, it's dangerous. It might be even more dangerous than prerogative, because prerogative still has to be exercised in the interest of the people. But if you have a prince or a king who just runs around, stabbing people, taking people's stuff, whatever, these mischiefs can add up and over a time, and they can kind of end up being their own justification, where they become precedent, right? In the same way that prerogative can be dangerous, because a good king may use prerogative in a good way, which then leads to a precedent for a bad king to use a similar prerogative for his own aggrandizement. In this case, it seems like an unnecessary carve out to say, well, no, you can't hurt the prince. I mean, no matter what he does, it's like, well, he's stealing my sheep. He, shot my wife. whipping my kids. At some point, this immunity has to becomes kind of absurd to maintain, especially considering how many crazed rulers we've seen over the course of history. Anyway, so yeah, so this is kind of like this notion that the prince's commissions are pretended, are fraudulent if they're executed in a way that breaks the law, is kind of a proto due process that that Locke is kind of creating here. This is kind of an embryonic form, if you want to call it that. So after this kind of weird aside where he made this carve out and then talks about why this carve out is necessary, he says, well, what if we don't have this carve out? Well, turns out things aren't that bad anyway. First off, if the relief of the injured party is possible, then there's still no justification for force. I think he's a little bit too glib about the possible corruption of courts, right? Like you could imagine a case where the courts have been kind of trained to always judge police officers innocent, and then a police officer does something horrible with no authorization to do so, and they're like, well, he's fine, he's a police officer. There's definitely some danger here that we need to watch out for. And Locke is being, I think, way too glib here about this possible kind of thorough corruption throughout the government, where the government justifies its own worst actions, right? Locke gives an example in section 207, where he talks about a robber. And I kind of mentioned this already, but, quote, just to get some actual quotes in here. Quote, a man with a sword in his hand demands my purse in the highway, when perhaps I have not 12 pence in my pocket. This man I may lawfully kill. To another I deliver 100 pounds, to hold only whilst I alight, which he refuses to restore me when I am got up again, but draws his sword to defend the possession of it by force, if I endeavor to take it, or to retake it. The mischief this man does me is 100, or possibly 1,000 times more than the other perhaps intended me, whom I killed before he really did me any. And yet I might lawfully kill the one, and cannot so much as hurt the other lawfully. The reason whereof is plain, because the one using force which threatened my life I could not have time to appeal to the law to secure it, and when it was gone it was too late to appeal. The law could not restore life to my dead carcass. The loss was irreparable, which to prevent the law of nature gave me a right to destroy him, who had put himself into a state of war with me and threatened my destruction. But in another case, my life not being in danger, I may have the benefit of appealing to the law and have reparation for my 100 pounds that way. There's an issue here, right? Because, the first case is pretty clear, that a person is pointing a sword at you and says, give me your wallet. Well, you can defend yourself against that. The second case, I think, is worth a little bit more careful examination. Because, sure, if I hand you $100, right, I fall down, and I'm like, oh, this $100 worth of gold is heavy. Hold on to it for a minute, for a second, and I stand up and say, give me my $100 back, and they say, what $100, right? There's certainly a case for me resorting to the courts in that case, because, it's daytime, you're standing there, I'm standing there, we're both looking at each other, I can identify you. In cases where a person attempts to take your property by stealth, it becomes more difficult for a person, or for a court, or for a police officer to hunt that down. And that's not to excuse them not trying to do their job and do the tracking that they could possibly do, right? But, one of the things I find a little troublesome is the way that defense of property goes from allowed to frowned upon to not permitted, right? And the effect that has on the institution of private property is, I think, something that we have to really be cautious to not encourage. I think that you could make the case that someone who tries to take something from you without your knowledge, right, is also possibly a valid target for self-defensive force, because this person intends to take your stuff and avoid identification by simply blending with everyone else. And certain things are fungible, and it can be very difficult to figure out who took the thing. I think defensive property is something that's very important for society to kind of maintain maintain itself. Once you start outlawing defensive property, property becomes less certain, and that leads to a bunch of negative incentives over the long run that kind of, results in this kind of the situation where we're in now, where the police don't even bother to find property anymore because they're just like, well, I hope you insured it. And I think that there might be some societies in a voluntarist system. I think there might be some groups that have that kind of situation, but I think that the group that says, yeah, you can defend your property is also going to have some positive aspects to it too. So this is something where I'm not quite sure that Locke is giving defensive property enough oomph when it really should have more. Now we get to a point, I think it's section 208. No, yeah, section 208 and 209, where Locke talks about as tyranny gets wider and wider in a particular system. He talks about how if the scope of a tyranny is very limited, if it only affects a small number of people, that's unlikely to lead to violence because of the overwhelming power of the state. Again, secession fixes this, right? If the government has decided to selectively not enforce you and 3 other people's property rights, the solution is to say this government is no longer serving our purposes and therefore we may leave and take our property, as opposed to just like, well, you're kind of stuck. Good luck. I think that the incentive structure created by a system that allows people to get out of a bad relationship like that has better incentives and helps to prevent tyranny from getting overly large. Because even if tyranny extends to a majority, or the majority recognizes a consequential threat to all, the state still can still have overwhelming power against the majority of regular people. Now, Locke says, well, nothing can stop if the whole society, or if a large majority of the society determines that the government has decided to, break its oath to them, right? Nothing, quote, I believe it's a quote, nothing can stop them from resisting. Or here it is. Quote, how they will be hindered from resisting illegal force used against them, I cannot tell. This is basically Locke giving an out to popular rebellions. Basically, hey, yeah, if your government is going to screw you over and it's doing it to everybody, then you're kind of justified in doing whatever it is that you have to do to get yourselves out from under that yoke. And yet at the same time, he's talking about how, well, your defensive property is only limited to this case and this case and this case. I mean, I don't want to say that any of these particular things are necessary, but at the same time, I think that the lack of any of them is insufficient to prove that the government or that the people have, too much power, that the government is limited enough or whatever like that. I mean, like there's going to be different societies that have different takes on these particular things based on culture or tradition or whatever, and I think all of as long as the right of the people to leave the society is respected, right? Then you kind of sidestep all these problems. Whereas with Locke's conception of dominion being kind of a permanent thing, or nearly permanent thing, then you end up with all these problems where, yeah, governments can decide that they're gonna find some little minority and subjugate them, and well, there's nothing they can do other than tell their sons and daughters to go somewhere else, which seems like a pretty bad bad recourse. And bad enough that it creates an incentive for governments to find these little groups, and as many of them as possible, to poke at in various different ways so that none of them have a chance to organize with each other. So, one thing Locke says at the very end of this chapter is that it is easy for a good governor to show that they are good, that they care about the people, that the people's well-being is part of their is at the forefront of their mind. And to a certain degree, this is true. But at the same time, what we have to watch out for nowadays, are for these totalitarian philosophies that where someone can get angry at the government because the government isn't using its power in a way that they believe is, like morally required. People who say, well, the government hasn't, to give a rather extreme example, to say, well, the government hasn't nationalized the oil industry, and therefore I am justified in attacking agents of the state because they haven't done this thing that I demand them to do, is different from saying I don't want you to do this to me, and like where Locke is saying, well, yeah, the good governors are obvious. There are actually totalitarian philosophies out there today for which what is obviously a good governor, someone who is judicious and careful and does things with the interests of the people in mind and follows the law, is actually someone that becomes the target of, if not, insults, ridicule, etc., possible actual violence for not exercising their power more vigorously against certain other minorities. So, this is one of those things that Locke doesn't talk about because it wasn't really an issue in his day. We had, he had semi-absolute and absolute monarchs to deal with, and he had to talk about how, they could make themselves legitimate, basically, by garnering the consent of the people. And nowadays we have all kinds of crazy totalitarian philosophies that demand a lot of positive rights for certain special interest groups. And this is not something that Locke, I think, anticipated. Finally, there's section 210 is the last section of this chapter. And what it really is, it's not so much a section of this chapter as it is a lead into the next chapter, which we'll cover next week. Chapter 19 of the Dissolution of Government, which is Locke's escape valve for bad government, is that if a government fails at its most fundamental requirements, then the government may be dissolved. And well, we'll see next week how that goes exactly, because I don't know. We're gonna poke at it from the same perspective we've been poking at it, because if it's necessary, according to Locke, for the Dominion to dissolve all at once, I argue that he's making an assumption that's not really justified by reality, that the borders of states can and do often change, and pretending to them to be some kind of perfect permanent thing is more of a danger than a good thing. So, yeah, next week we'll be covering the final chapter, I think. We'll see how it goes, because it might be that I find a more natural breaking point, and we might split it into two just because it's so darn long. We will talk about dissolving governments next week, and hopefully that'll be fun. So as always, thanks for watching, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my little, summary analysis critique. So with that, I'll say thanks for watching, thanks for listening. If you like the channel and you want to support what I'm doing here, you know what to do. And I will see you all next time.